Chapter 1. The Severance. The ritual chamber smelled of iron and incense, of promises unmade and futures undone. Isolde stood motionless before the obsidian altar, her wrist still bleeding from the shallow cut that had failed to bind her soul to the vampire she had been promised to since birth. The ceremonial blade lay discarded on the stone floor, its silver edge reflecting the flicker of 100 black candles. Around her, the ancient coven watched in silence, their pale faces carved from marble, their eyes glittering with something between pity and contempt. Lord Ambrose Theron had not moved from his place across the altar. His dark coat was immaculate, his expression as remote as the moon hanging beyond the stained glass windows. He had spoken only 3 words since the blood bond had shattered. It is done. But it was not done. It had never begun. Isolde had felt nothing when their blood touched. No surge of recognition, no tremor of fate weaving their souls together. The bond, prophesied by her family's seers for 3 generations, had simply refused to take root. The magic had recoiled from them both like water from oil, leaving only the sting of the wound and the weight of failure. Her mother had wept. Her father had turned his face away. And Lord Theron, the vampire king who ruled the northern territories with silent, absolute authority, had merely inclined his head and walked from the chamber as though she were already forgotten. "You are released from your obligation," the coven priestess intoned, her voice like frost cracking over stone. "The blood has spoken. There is no bond. There will be no union. Released." The word tasted bitter. Isolde had been raised for this. Every lesson, every restriction, every careful hour of her 23 years had pointed toward this single moment, the night she would become the bride of the vampire king, the bridge between mortal and immortal worlds, the fulfillment of a compact made before she was born. Now she was nothing, a failed vessel, a broken promise. She wrapped a strip of linen around her wrist with trembling fingers, aware of the eyes still watching her. No one offered comfort. No one dared. In the old laws, a rejected bondmate brought shame not only to herself, but to her entire bloodline. Her family's standing in the mortal courts would crumble. Her younger sister's marriage prospects would wither. And Isolde herself, she would be cast out, neither fully mortal nor touched by immortality, marked by a failure she could not explain. "Leave us," the priestess commanded. Isolde lifted her chin. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She turned from the altar, her pale gray gown whispering across the cold stone, and walked through the towering doors into the night beyond. The estate grounds stretched dark and vast beneath a sky choked with clouds. No stars, no moonlight, only the skeletal silhouettes of ancient oaks and the distant glow of the mortal village far below the cliffs. The wind carried the scent of rain and dying roses. She walked, past the iron gates that had been opened for her arrival in hope and would close behind her in disgrace. Past the graveyard where Theron's mortal ancestors lay, entombed beneath marble angels. Past the boundary stones carved with runes of protection that no longer applied to her. Her family's carriage waited at the edge of the estate, but she could not bring herself to climb inside. Not yet. Not while her mother's tears still burned in her memory, not while her father's silence still rang louder than any accusation. So she kept walking, down the narrow road that wound through the forest toward the village. Her slippers grew damp with dew. Her breath misted in the cold air. She felt hollow, scraped clean of purpose, a shell that had once held something precious and now contained only absence. Why had the bond failed? The question circled through her mind like a carrion bird. The seers had been so certain. Her bloodline was pure, her lineage traced back to the first mortal families who had made pacts with the vampire lord centuries ago. She had prepared herself, body, mind, and spirit, to be joined to an immortal. She had accepted the strangeness of it, the sacrifice, the inevitability. And yet, when her blood had touched his, there had been nothing. No recognition. No pull. Only emptiness. She stopped walking. The forest pressed close on either side of the road, dark and watchful. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The sound echoed through the trees like a warning. Isolde turned slowly, scanning the shadows behind her. She felt it suddenly, the crawling certainty that she was not alone, that something was watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle and her heartbeat quicken. But there was nothing. Only trees and darkness and the faint glow of the estate far behind her. She wrapped her arms around herself and continued forward, quickening her pace. The village was still miles away. She would have to return to the carriage eventually, face her family's grief and disappointment, begin the long, uncertain process of rebuilding a life she had never planned for. The sound of hooves on stone made her freeze. She turned. Through the mist rising from the forest floor, a carriage emerged. Black as a raven's wing, drawn by 4 horses whose coats gleamed like polished obsidian. The driver was a shadow in a hooded cloak. The wheels made no sound despite the rough road, and on the door, painted in silver that seemed to glow with its own cold light, was the crest of the Vampire King. Isolde's breath caught. The carriage rolled to a stop before her, silent and impossible. The door swung open on soundless hinges. Inside, the interior was lined with black velvet. A single lantern burned with pale blue flame. And seated across from the empty place was Lord Ambrose Theron himself, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not name. "Get in," he said softly. It was not a request. Chapter 2. The Summons. Isolde did not move. Her pulse hammered against her throat, loud enough that she wondered if he could hear it, wondered if the ancient creature watching her from within the shadowed carriage could sense the fear and confusion warring beneath her skin. "I released you," she said, and hated how her voice trembled. "The bond failed. There is nothing between us." Lord Theron leaned forward slightly, and the lantern light caught the sharp planes of his face, the high cheekbones, the mouth that might have been beautiful if it ever softened, the eyes that held centuries of secrets she could not begin to fathom. "That," he said quietly, "is why you must come with me." The words made no sense. The ritual had failed. The coven priestess herself had declared them unbound. Isolde was free to return to her family, to fade into obscurity, to live whatever half-life awaited a failed bondmate in the mortal world. "I don't understand." "No," Theron agreed. "You do not. But you will." He extended one gloved hand toward the open door, a gesture both elegant and commanding. "Please, I would not ask if it were not necessary." Necessary. The word hung between them like smoke. Isolde glanced back toward the estate, barely visible now through the thickening mist. Her family would be preparing to leave, packing away the hope they had carried with them. They would assume she had walked ahead in grief, that she would meet them at the gates or return to the carriage when her pride allowed. They would not know she had been summoned back by the very man who had rejected her. "If I refuse?" she asked. Something flickered in Theron's expression. Not anger, but something deeper and more dangerous. "Then I will have failed twice in one night, and the consequences will fall upon more than just you and I." The threat was velvet-wrapped, but unmistakable. Isolde stepped forward. She did not climb into the carriage out of obedience or fear, but because the alternative, walking away without answers, carrying the weight of this failure for the rest of her life, was unbearable. The moment she settled onto the velvet seat, the door closed. The carriage lurched into motion. Theron watched her in silence for a long moment. He had removed his gloves, and she found herself staring at his hands, long-fingered, impossibly still, the hands of a pianist or a surgeon, the hands that had reached for hers across the altar and felt nothing. "You are afraid," he observed. "I am confused," Isolde corrected. "You declared the bond broken. You walked away." "I did." His voice was soft, almost regretful. "Because remaining in that chamber, surrounded by witnesses who had already declared our failure, would have made what I needed to do impossible." "What you needed to do?" Theron was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the carriage window, the darkness rushing past, the forest that seemed to close around them like a fist. "Tell me, Isolde," he said at last, "do you know why the blood bond exists?" She blinked at the question. "To unite mortal and immortal bloodlines, to maintain the peace between our worlds. That is what your family taught you, but it is not the whole truth." He turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw something almost human in his expression, a weariness that made him look less like a king and more like a man who had carried an impossible burden for far too long. "The blood bond is not merely political, it is a seal, a lock against something that must never be opened." Cold dread unfurled in Isolde's chest. "What do you mean?" "Every generation, a bondmate is chosen from the mortal families who made the original pact. The ritual binds their life force to the vampire kings, creating a barrier that contains an old darkness, a hunger that predates my rule, that sleeps beneath this land and must be kept sleeping." Isolde's mouth went dry. "You're saying I was meant to be part of a prison?" "Yes." Theron's eyes held hers. "And tonight, for the first time in 300 years, the bond failed to form, which means the seal is weakening, which means the thing we have kept locked away is beginning to wake." The carriage swayed as it turned sharply, climbing now, heading back toward the estate rather than away from it. Isolde gripped the edge of the seat, her mind reeling. "But why did it fail? I did everything." "You did nothing wrong." Theron's voice was firm. "The fault is not yours, Isolde. It is mine." She stared at him. "How can it be your fault?" He looked away again, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. When he spoke, his voice was so low she almost didn't hear it. "Because I am not the vampire king who made the original pact. I am the second son. The spare. The one who was never meant to rule." He paused, and something like pain crossed his features. "My brother died 2 centuries ago. I took his crown, his throne, his responsibilities. But I did not inherit the bloodline magic that sustained the seal. I have been improvising, holding the barrier through will alone. And tonight, when your blood touched mine, the magic knew. It knew I was not the true heir, and it rejected us both." The words settled over Isolde like snow, cold and suffocating. "Then what happens now?" she whispered. Theron finally looked at her again, and the expression in his eyes made her heart twist. Grief and determination and something else, something almost like hope. "Now," he said softly, "we find another way to seal the darkness, before it rises and devours everything we both hold dear." The carriage stopped. Isolde glanced out the window and saw that they had arrived not at the main estate, but at a smaller structure half hidden among the trees. An old stone tower wrapped in ivy, its windows dark save for one at the very top, where a single candle burned. "This is the archive," Theron said as the door opened. "It holds every record of the blood bond, every variation of the ritual, every contingency planned for should the seal ever weaken." He stepped out, then turned back to offer his hand. "If there is an answer, it is here, and we have perhaps 3 days to find it." 3 days? Isolde took his hand without thinking, felt the cool strength of his grip. "Until what?" Theron's expression was grim. "Until the creature beneath the earth breaks free, and everything you know turns to ash and blood." Chapter 3: The Archive of Shadows, The tower was older than the estate, older perhaps than the forest itself. Isolde felt it the moment she crossed the threshold, a heaviness in the air, the weight of accumulated years and forgotten secrets pressing down like a physical thing. The walls were lined with shelves that spiraled upward into darkness, each one crammed with leather-bound volumes, rolled parchments, and objects she could not name. Candles floated unsupported in the air, their flames casting restless shadows that seemed to move with purpose. Theron led her up a winding staircase, his footsteps silent on the worn stone. She followed, acutely aware of how loud her own breathing sounded in the enclosed space, how mortal and fragile she felt surrounded by so much immortal history. "No one has entered this place in 50 years, Theron said without turning. The last bondmate, Lady Marguerite, spent her final days here, trying to understand why the seal had begun to crack even during her lifetime. Did she find anything? She found warnings." He paused on a landing, glancing back at her. Prophecies that suggested the seal would not hold forever, that eventually, the bloodline magic would fade, and a choice would have to be made. What choice? But Theron had already resumed climbing, and Isolde hurried to keep pace. The room at the top of the tower was circular, dominated by a massive table covered in maps, diagrams, and open books held down by weights shaped like ravens. More candles burned here, arranged in patterns that Isolde recognized vaguely from her studies: protection circles, binding runes, symbols meant to ward off malevolent spirits. Theron moved to the table and began sorting through the documents with practiced efficiency. The original pact was made by my ancestor, King Lucian, and 7 mortal families who agreed to provide bondmates in exchange for protection from the creature that had been ravaging their lands. The creature, known only as the Devourer, fed on fear and blood, and could not be killed. So Lucian trapped it instead, using his own life force and the power of the mortal bond to seal it beneath the castle foundations. Isolde approached the table slowly, her eyes catching on a faded illustration, a monstrous thing with too many limbs and eyes like burning coals, rising from a pit of shadows. And every generation since, a new bond has renewed the seal. Yes, until tonight. Theron's jaw tightened. When the magic recognized that I am not of Lucian's direct line and refused to bind us. She stared at the maps, at the layers of notation and correction that marked centuries of careful maintenance. "You said we have 3 days. How do you know?" "Because I can feel it waking." Theron's hand pressed flat against the table, and for the first time, Isolde saw the tension in his shoulders, the strain of holding something back. "I have spent 200 years using my own power to shore up the seal my brother left behind, but it is failing, and when it breaks completely, the Devourer will rise, and it will consume every living thing within 100 miles before we can even attempt to stop it." The certainty in his voice made her blood run cold. "Then why bring me here?" Isolde asked. "If the bond won't work, if I'm useless to you?" "You are not useless." Theron turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gaze pinned her in place. "The bond failed because of my bloodline, not yours, which means your family's magic is still intact. Still viable. If we can find another way to channel it, another method of binding your life force to the seal without relying on my corrupted lineage, we might still succeed." Hope and dread warred in Isolde's chest. "What kind of method?" "That is what we must discover." He gestured to the shelves around them. "Somewhere in this archive is a record of alternative rituals, older magic, the kind that existed before the blood bond became the standard." He paused, then added quietly, "It will be dangerous. The old magic always demands a higher price." Isolde looked around at the impossible number of volumes, the centuries of accumulated knowledge. "Where do we even begin?" Theron pulled a leathered journal from beneath a stack of maps and opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in handwriting so ornate it was almost illegible. Lady Marguerite's final notes. She believed the answer lay in the original ritual, that Lucian had used a method more complex than the simple blood bond we've relied on since. He began to read aloud, his voice soft in the candlelit dimness. The first binding was not mere blood but soul and shadow intertwined. Lucian gave of himself completely, not just his immortal power, but his capacity for love, for warmth, for the gentle human emotions he had carried from his mortal life. In exchange, the mortal bride, Lady Alara, offered not just her blood, but her dreams, her hopes, her tethered mortality. Together, they became a lock that could not be broken, because it was forged from willing sacrifice on both sides. Theron fell silent, staring at the page. Isolde's throat tightened. "Sacrifice," she whispered. "What kind of sacrifice?" "The kind that changes you irrevocably." He closed the journal slowly. Lucian was never the same after the binding. By all accounts, he became colder, more distant. As though he had lost some essential part of himself. His eyes lifted to hers. And Lady Alara lived only 10 years afterward. The bond sustained the seal, but it drained her life force at an accelerated rate. The implication hung between them, heavy and undeniable. "You're saying that if we perform the original ritual, I will die young," Isolde said. "And you will lose whatever humanity you have left." "Yes." She should have felt angry, betrayed. Instead, she felt only a strange, cold clarity. "And if we do nothing?" "Everyone dies. Your family, the mortal villages, perhaps even the immortal courts, if the devourer grows strong enough." Theron's expression was unreadable. "I brought you here to give you a choice, Isolde. The Coven declared us unbound. You are free to leave, to live whatever life remains to you. I will not force you to walk into this darkness with me." Isolde looked down at her bandaged wrist, at the wound that had failed to bind her to this strange, haunted man. She thought of her mother's tears, her father's disappointment. She thought of her sister, barely 16, whose future would crumble if the estate fell. She thought of the creature in the illustration, all teeth and hunger and endless void. "Show me the ritual," she said quietly. Theron's eyes widened slightly, the first real surprise she had seen him display. "Show me what we have to do," Isolde repeated, lifting her chin. "And I will decide if I am brave enough to pay the price." For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "But you should know. Once you see it, once you understand the full scope of what is required, there will be no unknowing it. You will carry this knowledge for the rest of your life, however long or short that may be." Isolde met his gaze steadily. "Then let me carry it," she said. "I have already been marked by this night. I would rather walk into the darkness knowing why than spend my life haunted by questions." Something shifted in Theron's expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "Come," he said, and led her deeper into the archive, where the oldest and most dangerous knowledge waited. Chapter 4. The Weight of Souls. The ritual was written in a language Isolde did not recognize, but Theron translated it with grim precision. They sat across from each other at the raven-weighted table, the ancient manuscript spread between them like a map to their potential destruction. Outside, the night deepened, and Isolde realized distantly that dawn could not be far off, that her family had likely returned home by now, believing her lost to grief and shame. She pushed the thought away. There would be time for explanations later. Or there would be nothing at all. The original binding required 3 elements, Theron explained, his finger tracing the faded ink. Blood, as expected, but also breath and shadow. Breath and shadow? Isolde leaned closer despite herself. What does that mean? Breath represents life force, the animating spirit that separates the living from the dead. In the ritual, both participants must share breath, transferring a portion of their essential vitality to one another. He paused, and Isolde realized he was giving her time to understand the implication. Her cheeks warmed. You mean a kiss? Not merely a kiss. A deliberate exchange, prolonged and unbroken until the transfer is complete. His voice remained clinical, but she saw the tension in his jaw. It is not meant to be romantic, Isolde. It is a conduit. Nothing more. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. And Shadow? She managed after a moment. Theron's expression darkened. This is where the ritual becomes truly dangerous. Shadow refers to the darkest part of each participant, the fears, the guilts, the buried sins they have never spoken aloud. In the binding, these shadows must be extracted, made visible, and then woven together into the foundation of the seal. Isolde's stomach turned. How? Through confession and witnessing. He looked away, toward the candles that burned without consuming their wicks. Each participant must speak their deepest shame aloud, while the other listens without judgment. The magic will draw those confessed shadows forth and bind them into the seal, making it stronger than mere blood or power ever could. The room felt suddenly too small, too close. Isolde thought of the things she had never told anyone, the small cruelties of childhood, the jealousies she harbored toward her perfect sister, the nights she had lain awake wondering if she was capable of love at all, or if she was simply performing the role expected of her. And if we refuse to confess, she whispered, if we lie, then the ritual fails and the seal breaks. Theron's eyes found hers again. There can be no deception in this magic, Isolde. It requires absolute vulnerability, which is why so few would attempt it, and why the simpler blood bond became the standard. She understood now why Lady Marguerite's notes had been so cryptic, why King Lucian had reportedly become cold and distant afterward. To strip yourself bare before another, to have your worst self seen and accepted. It was a kind of death. A remaking. How long do we have to decide? She asked. The moon will be full in 2 nights. That is when the original ritual was performed, when the barrier between worlds is thinnest and magic runs strongest. He closed the manuscript carefully. We must begin preparations tomorrow night at the latest, which means you have until dawn to choose. Dawn. A few hours. Isolde stood abruptly, needing space, needing air. She moved to one of the narrow windows and stared out at the darkness. The forest below was a sea of shadows, and somewhere beneath it all, something ancient and hungry was stirring in its sleep. Can I ask you something? She said without turning. Yes. Why did you walk away tonight? In the ritual chamber, when the bond failed, you left so quickly, without explanation. She heard him rise, heard the soft sound of his footsteps approaching. He stopped a few paces behind her, close enough that she could feel the strange coolness that surrounded him, the absence of warmth that marked all his kind. Because I was ashamed, he said quietly. Isolde turned to face him. His expression was unguarded now, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. For 200 years I have ruled in my brother's place. I have made decisions, dispensed justice, maintained the fragile peace between our people. And in all that time, I told myself I was enough, that my will and determination could compensate for my lack of true bloodline magic. His hands clenched at his sides. Tonight proved me wrong, and worse, it punished you for my inadequacy. You were raised your entire life for a purpose I could not fulfill. I could not bear to face you in that moment. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. It wasn't your fault, Isolde said. You didn't choose to be the second son. You didn't choose for your brother to die. No, but I chose to hide the truth of my limitations. I chose to let your family believe the bond would work, when I should have warned them years ago that it might fail. He exhaled slowly. I convinced myself that my desire to protect our people justified the deception, but tonight, seeing your face when the magic rejected us, I realized I was simply afraid of being exposed as insufficient, as false. Isolde had been taught to think of vampires as creatures beyond human emotion, cold, calculating, dangerous. But the man before her was none of those things. He was simply lost, trying desperately to hold together a world that was crumbling despite his best efforts. If we do this, she said slowly, if we perform the original ritual, will it work? Can your shadow and mine truly seal what your bloodline cannot? I don't know, Theron admitted. Lady Marguerite believed it could. The text suggests the soul binding is stronger than the blood binding precisely because it requires more. But there are no guarantees, Isolde, only hope and desperation. She studied his face, the sharp lines, the eyes that had seen centuries pass, the mouth that seemed to have forgotten how to smile. What is your shadow? She asked impulsively. What would you confess if we went through with this? Theron was silent for a long moment. Then, I would confess that I envy my brother still. That even after 200 years I resent him for dying and leaving me with a crown I never wanted and responsibilities I cannot fulfill. I would confess that some nights I wish I had died in his place. That the burden would have passed to someone stronger, someone worthy. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. And I would confess that when I saw you tonight, young and brave and willing to give yourself to a fate you didn't understand, I hated myself for needing you. For dragging another innocent into the darkness I have failed to contain. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through Isolde's chest. She reached out before she could stop herself, her fingers brushing his sleeve. He went very still, as though touch were something foreign and dangerous. You don't seem insufficient to me, she said softly. You seem like someone who has carried too much, for far too long, with no one to help shoulder the weight. Theron looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, gratitude, and beneath it all, a loneliness so profound it made her heart ache. Dawn is coming, he said hoarsely. You should rest. Use one of the rooms downstairs. When you wake, if you choose to stay, we will begin preparations. And if I choose to leave? Then I will have a carriage take you home, and I will face the devourer alone. Isolde withdrew her hand slowly. You would die. Yes. And everyone else would die with you. Most likely. She held his gaze. That's not really a choice then, is it? A ghost of something, not quite a smile but close, touched Theron's lips. No, he agreed. I suppose it isn't. But I needed you to have the illusion of one, even if only for a few hours. Isolde turned back toward the stairs, but before she descended she looked over her shoulder one last time. I'll stay, she said. Not because I have no choice, but because someone should stand with you in the darkness, and it seems I'm the only one available. Then she left him alone in the candlelit archive, surrounded by the weight of centuries and the shadows of his own making. Chapter 5. Preparations in Moonlight. Isolde did not sleep. She lay in the small chamber Theron had directed her to, a room with stone walls softened by tapestries depicting long-dead kings and forgotten battles, and watched the darkness slowly fade beyond the narrow window. Her mind circled endlessly through the ritual's requirements, through the enormity of what she had agreed to attempt. By the time dawn broke pale and gray over the forest, she had made a kind of peace with her decision. Or perhaps she had simply grown numb to the fear. She found Theron in the estate's eastern courtyard, a space enclosed by high walls and overgrown with night-blooming flowers that seemed to glow faintly in the early light. He stood motionless beside a stone fountain long since run dry, his dark coat replaced by a simple white shirt that made him look younger, more human. "You're awake," he observed without turning. "I never slept." Isolde approached slowly, her borrowed cloak, one of the household servants had left it outside her door, wrapped tight against the morning chill. "What happens now?" "Now we prepare." Theron finally looked at her, and she was struck by how exhausted he appeared. Had he spent the night in vigil as well? The ritual requires certain conditions, a sacred space, untouched by violence or deception. "I've chosen the old chapel on the estate's northern boundary. It hasn't been used in over a century, but the consecration should still hold." "What else?" "Fasting. For both of us." A wry note entered his voice. "Though, in your case, that means abstaining from food. In mine, it means abstaining from blood. Neither of us can carry external sustenance into the ritual. Our bodies must be empty vessels, reliant only on what we give each other." Isolde's stomach clenched. She had seen vampires in bloodlust before, the trembling, the loss of control, the danger they posed to anyone nearby. "How long since you last fed?" 4 days. "I can manage another 2 without significant risk." He paused. "But you should know, by tomorrow night I will not be entirely myself. The hunger makes us sharper, more volatile. If I frighten you, you must tell me immediately." She nodded, filing the warning away. "There's something else," Theron continued. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in black silk. "The ritual requires tokens, something that represents each participant's mortal life, something cherished." He unwrapped the silk to reveal a tarnished silver locket, delicate and clearly ancient. He opened it carefully, and Isolde glimpsed a painted miniature inside, a woman with kind eyes and dark hair holding an infant. "My mother," Theron said softly. "And my brother, when he was newly born. I was 7 years old when this was commissioned. It's the only image of her I have left. She died the following winter." He closed the locket, his thumb tracing its worn edge. "This is what I will bring into the circle. The last remnant of the life I had before I became what I am." Isolde's throat tightened. She had expected something grand, a crown perhaps, or a weapon. Not this small, intimate thing that spoke of love and loss. "I don't have anything like that with me," she admitted. "Everything I own is back at my family's estate." "Then we'll retrieve it." Theron pocketed the locket again. "I'll have a carriage made ready. You can return home briefly, see your family, gather what you need, but tell them nothing of the ritual, for their safety and ours." "What should I tell them?" "That the Vampire King has requested your continued presence, that there are negotiations, discussions of alternative arrangements." His expression was carefully neutral. "It's not entirely a lie." No, Isolde thought. Just an omission of the fact that those alternative arrangements might kill them both. "I'll need to leave within the hour if I'm to return before nightfall," she said. "The roads are difficult, and my family's lands are half a day's journey. Take 2 of my horses. They're faster than mortal breeds, and they know the forest paths." Theron turned toward the fountain, his hand resting on its weathered stone edge. "Isolde, when you see your family, pay attention. Notice the small things. The way your mother's hands move when she's anxious, the sound of your sister's laugh, the smell of your father's pipe tobacco." She frowned. "Why?" "Because if the ritual succeeds but the cost is high, if you end up like Lady Alara, with only a few years remaining, those small memories will be what sustain you." His voice was low, almost gentle. "I have lived for centuries, And I can tell you with certainty that it is not the grand moments we cling to in the darkness. It is the mundane ones, the ordinary tenderness we took for granted. The words settled over Isolde like a shroud. She had been so focused on the ritual itself, on the immediate danger of the devourer, that she had not truly considered the long aftermath, the slow draining of her life force, the knowledge that every day brought her closer to an early grave. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Taking your brother's crown? Living all these years?" Theron was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I regret that I was not given a choice. But I do not regret the people I have been able to protect, the small goods I have managed to do despite my inadequacy." He glanced at her, and something in his expression softened. "And I find, strangely, that I do not regret meeting you. Even under these circumstances." Heat crept up Isolde's neck. "I'm just the bondmate who failed." "No. You're the woman who chose to stay when you could have walked away, who looked at an impossible situation and decided to face it anyway." His eyes held hers. "That is no small thing, Isolde. Do not diminish it." She had to look away, her heart beating too fast. "I should go. Prepare for the journey." "One more thing." Theron's voice stopped her at the courtyard entrance. "When you choose your token, make sure it's something you're willing to sacrifice. The ritual will bind it into the seal along with your shadow. You won't be able to keep it afterward." Isolde turned back. "What happens to it?" "It becomes part of the prison, part of the lock that holds the devourer." His expression was grave. "So choose carefully. Choose something that matters enough to make the magic strong, but not so precious that losing it will break you." She nodded slowly, then left him standing alone beside the empty fountain, a figure carved from solitude and ancient sorrow. The ride back to her family's estate was a blur of forest and speed. Theron's horses were indeed faster than any mortal breed. Their hooves seemed to barely touch the ground, their breathing steady and tireless. Isolde clung to the saddle and tried to prepare herself for the lies she would have to tell. Her mother wept when she saw her. Her father's relief was palpable despite his stern expression. And her sister, sweet, 16-year-old Clarissa, threw her arms around Isolde's neck and whispered, "I thought you'd never come back." "I'm here," Isolde murmured into her sister's hair. "I'm here." But even as she said it, she knew it was temporary. That after tomorrow night, she might return in body, but not in spirit. That the girl who had left this house for the failed ritual would not be the same woman who came home afterward, if she came home at all. "Tell us everything," her mother insisted, leading her toward the sitting room. "What did the vampire king want? Why did his carriage come for you?" Isolde spun the story Theron had suggested. Negotiations, alternative political arrangements, the possibility of a different kind of alliance. Her parents listened with cautious hope, and she hated herself for giving them false expectations. But what else could she do? Tell them the truth? That their daughter would bind herself to a cursed vampire in a ritual that would slowly kill her, all to prevent a monster from devouring the countryside? They would never let her go. And the devourer would wake anyway. So she lied, and smiled, and tried to memorize the way her mother's hands fluttered when she was anxious, just as Theron had advised. When she finally escaped to her childhood bedroom to gather her belongings, Clarissa followed. "You're not telling us everything," her sister said quietly, closing the door behind her. Isolde froze, her hand on the jewelry box where she kept her most precious possessions. "What makes you say that?" "Because I know you." Clarissa sat on the edge of the bed, her expression more mature than her years. "You have that look. The one you get when you're trying to protect people from something terrible." Isolde's throat ached. "Clarissa, you don't have to tell me." Her sister's voice wavered. "Just promise you'll be careful. Promise you'll come back." She wanted to make that promise, wanted it desperately. But she thought of Lady Alara, dead at 28. She thought of the ritual's cost, the shadows she would have to confess, the life force she would pour into a seal that might hold for years or might crumble within months. "I promise," she said anyway, "that I will do everything in my power to see you again." It was the best she could offer. She chose her token with shaking hands, a music box her grandmother had given her when she was 8 years old, carved from cherry wood and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. It played a lullaby that had soothed her through countless childhood nightmares. It was precious. It was meaningful. It was enough to sacrifice. She wrapped it carefully in a scarf and tucked it into her bag along with a change of clothes and the few other necessities she would need. When she hugged her family goodbye, her mother's perfume, her father's steady heartbeat, Clarissa's desperate grip, she tried to memorize it all, just as Theron had said. The ordinary tenderness, the mundane moments that might have to last a lifetime, or beyond. The ride back to the estate was harder than the journey out. The sun was setting, painting the forest in shades of blood and gold, and Isolde felt every mile like a step closer to a precipice she could not see beyond. Theron waited for her in the courtyard, exactly where she had left him hours ago. He looked up as she dismounted, and something in his expression, relief, perhaps, or gratitude, made her chest constrict. "You came back," he said, as though he had genuinely believed she might not. Isolde approached slowly, her bag slung over one shoulder. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might come to your senses." A ghost of dark humor touched his voice. "Realize that binding yourself to a cursed vampire in a ritual designed 2 centuries ago is perhaps not the wisest course of action." "It's not," Isolde agreed, "but it's the only course we have." She pulled the wrapped music box from her bag and held it out. "My token. It was my grandmother's. She sang the lullaby it plays to my mother, and my mother sang it to me. It's the sound of being safe, of being loved." Theron took it carefully, his fingers brushing hers. "Then it will make the seal strong." He paused, studying her face. "You said goodbye to them properly? Your family?" "As properly as I could without telling them the truth." He nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, at moonrise, we begin. Until then, you should rest and eat what you can. Once the fasting starts, you'll need your strength." Isolde hesitated, then asked the question that had haunted her all day. "Are you afraid?" Theron looked at her for a long moment. Then, with a frankness that stole her breath, "Terrified." And somehow, that made her feel less alone. Chapter 6. The Chapel of Broken Vows. The old chapel stood at the edge of a cliff, its stone walls wrapped in ivy and neglect. Isolde approached it in the dying light of the following day, her stomach hollow from fasting, her nerves stretched thin. Theron walked beside her, silent and tense. He had not spoken more than a handful of words since dawn, and she wondered if the bloodlust was beginning to affect him, if the careful control he maintained was fraying at the edges. "It's beautiful," she said softly, more to break the silence than because she meant it. But perhaps she did mean it. Despite its abandonment, the chapel retained a certain austere grace, the arched doorway, the narrow windows still holding fragments of colored glass, the bell tower reaching toward a sky turning purple with approaching night. "It was built by my great-grandfather," Theron said, "for the mortal bride he took, Lady Celestine. She was devout, and he loved her enough to create a place where she could worship without fear." He paused at the threshold. "She's buried beneath the altar. Her mortal life ended here, peacefully, after 50 years of marriage." 50 years. Lady Celestine had been fortunate then. Or perhaps the bond had worked differently in her time, before the bloodline magic began to fracture. Theron pushed open the heavy wooden doors and they stepped inside. The interior was simpler than Isolde expected. A single central aisle lined with broken pews, an altar of white stone, cracked but intact, and above, a ceiling painted with faded stars, a night sky captured in pigment and gold leaf, now peeling but still beautiful. "We have until moonrise to prepare," Theron said. He set down the bag he carried, which clinked softly with glass vials and other ritual components. "The space must be cleansed and the circle drawn. I'll handle the technical elements. You should center yourself. Prepare for what comes next." Isolde watched as he began to work, tracing symbols on the stone floor with chalk mixed with ash, placing candles at precise intervals, murmuring words in a language that made the air shiver and hum. He moved with practiced precision, but she could see the strain in him now, the way his hands trembled slightly, the tightness around his mouth. "When did you last feed?" she asked quietly. 7 days ago." He didn't look up from his work. "I'll manage." "You said 2 days would be difficult. It's been more than that." "I miscalculated." A bitter edge entered his voice. "Or perhaps I simply hoped I was stronger than I am." Isolde crossed to where he knelt, completing an intricate knotwork pattern. She crouched beside him, close enough to see the fine tremor running through his entire frame. "What happens if you can't control it?" she asked. "During the ritual?" Theron finally met her eyes, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Hunger, yes, but also fear. Raw and honest. "Then I might hurt you," he said bluntly. "The ritual requires blood exchange, but it must be measured, controlled. If I lose myself to the hunger, I could take too much, drain you before the binding completes." "Would that kill me?" "Almost certainly." The answer sat between them, stark and unavoidable. "But you'll try to control it," Isolde said. "Not a question." "With everything I have," his jaw clenched. "But you should know the risk, Isolde. You should understand that the greatest danger tonight might not be the ritual itself, but me." She reached out slowly, carefully, and placed her hand over his where it rested on the stone floor. His skin was cool, and she felt the tremor intensify at her touch, whether from hunger or something else. She couldn't tell. "I trust you," she said. "You shouldn't." "Perhaps not." She managed a small smile. "But I do anyway." Theron stared at her hand on his for a long moment. Then, gently, he withdrew and returned to his work. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Less rigid, perhaps. Or maybe just resigned to the inadequacy of his own warnings. By the time the moon began to rise, the chapel had been transformed. The circle glowed faintly on the floor, inscribed with symbols that seemed to move in the candlelight. The air hummed with gathered magic, thick and expectant. And at the center, 2 cushions had been placed facing each other, with a small table between them holding the ritual implements. A silver blade, 2 crystal cups, and their tokens. Isolde's music box looked small and vulnerable beside Theron's locket. "It's time," Theron said quietly. They took their positions within the circle, kneeling, facing each other across a distance of perhaps 3 feet. Close enough to touch, but not touching. Not yet. Theron had changed into ceremonial robes, black silk embroidered with silver thread in patterns that matched the circle's symbols. Isolde wore the simple white dress that had been waiting in her chamber, unadorned, save for a belt of braided cord. Bride and groom, she thought distantly, or perhaps priest and sacrifice? "The ritual has 4 phases," Theron explained, his voice taking on a formal cadence. "Blood, to mingle our life forces. Breath, to exchange our vitality. Shadow, to bind our confessed darkness. And finally, covenant, the sealing of the bond and its integration into the prison that holds the devourer." He picked up the silver blade. "We begin with blood. Your wrist, please." Isolde extended her left hand, the one that had been cut during the failed ritual. Theron's fingers closed around her wrist, gentle but firm, and she felt the whisper of the blade across her skin. The pain was sharp and brief, and then blood welled from the shallow cut. He held one of the crystal cups beneath it, catching the dark drops. Then he lifted his own wrist to his mouth, and she watched with mingled fascination and horror as his fangs descended, elegant and terrible, and he bit into his own flesh without hesitation. His blood fell into the second cup, paler than hers, with a faint luminescence. He set the blade aside and lifted both cups, swirling them gently until the contents mixed, mortal and immortal, red and silver white, becoming something neither and both. "Drink," he said, offering her one of the cups. "And when you do, speak your intention. Tell the magic what you offer." Isolde took the cup with shaking hands. The liquid inside was warm and smelled of copper and moonlight. She raised it to her lips. "I offer my blood freely," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To seal the darkness, to protect the living, to stand as guardian until my last breath." The blood touched her tongue, strange and sweet and burning all at once. She forced herself to swallow, to drain the cup completely, feeling the magic ignite in her veins like liquid fire. Across from her, Theron drank from his own cup, his eyes never leaving hers. When he finished, he spoke the same words she had, but his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I offer my blood freely, to seal the darkness, to protect the living, to stand as guardian until my last breath." The circle flared with sudden light. The candles burned brighter, and Isolde felt something shift deep in her chest, a tugging sensation, as though a thread had been tied around her heart and was slowly pulling taut. Theron set down his cup, and she saw that his hands no longer trembled. The magic had steadied him, given him temporary relief from the hunger, but his eyes had darkened. And when he spoke again, his voice was rough with barely suppressed need. "Blood is done," he said. "Now we move to breath. Are you ready?" Isolde's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what came next. The kiss that was not a kiss. The exchange of vitality, prolonged and unbroken. The intimacy of it terrified her. But she nodded. "I'm ready." Theron rose smoothly and moved around the small table. He knelt before her, close enough now that she could feel the coolness radiating from his body, could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of centuries of weariness. "It will feel strange," he warned softly, "like drowning and flying at once. Don't fight it. Let the magic flow between us." He cupped her face in his hands, cool palms against her feverish skin, and leaned forward. Their lips met, and the world caught fire. Chapter 7. The Breath Between Souls. It was not a kiss, it was an unmaking. The moment Theron's mouth claimed hers, Isolde felt the magic surge between them, a current that flowed from her lungs to his and back again in an endless, dizzying exchange. Her breath became his became hers. And with each transfer, she felt pieces of herself scattering like leaves in wind, mingling with pieces of him until she could no longer tell where she ended and he began. She gasped against his mouth, and he swallowed the sound. His hands tightened on her face, anchoring her as the world spun. She could taste centuries on his tongue, blood and darkness and the bitter ash of things lost long ago. Could feel the hunger prowling beneath his control, a beast pacing the edges of his will. And beneath that, something softer, lonelier. The breath between them grew hot, then cold, then hot again. Her lungs burned. Her head swam. She clutched at his shoulders, the silk of his robe slippery beneath her fingers, and held on as the magic pulled her deeper into the connection. "Let go," something whispered. "Stop fighting." So she did. She stopped trying to maintain the boundaries between herself and this strange, ancient creature. Stopped clinging to her sense of self, and the moment she surrendered, the magic stabilized. No longer a violent torrent, but a steady stream, flowing between them with hypnotic rhythm. She could feel his heartbeat now. Slow, measured. Nothing like a mortal's frantic pulse. And he could feel hers, she realized, racing and wild and alive in a way he had not been for hundreds of years. Beautiful. A thought drifted through the connection. His or hers? She couldn't tell. You're so beautifully alive. Time lost meaning. Seconds or minutes or hours might have passed as they knelt there, locked together, sharing breath and blood and something deeper still. She felt his exhaustion, the weight of 2 centuries spent holding back disaster. Felt his fear that this ritual would fail, that she would die for nothing, that he would be left alone again in the darkness. And he felt her. She knew. Felt her determination, her quiet terror, the love she carried for her family and the guilt of lying to them. Felt the way she had been taught to suppress herself, to perform the role of dutiful daughter, obedient bride-to-be. Felt the small, secret part of her that had wondered sometimes what it would be like to choose her own path. You are choosing, his thought whispered through her. You chose to stay, to stand with me, because no one else would. Yes, and that makes you braver than you know. The connection deepened further, and Isolde realized with a shock that she could see fragments of his memories now, images flickering past like cards in a shuffled deck. A young boy with dark hair, laughing as he chased his older brother through castle halls. A crown placed on unwilling shoulders, too heavy, too soon. A woman with pale hair and sad eyes, one of the bondmates, she realized, though not Lady Marguerite. Someone earlier. Someone he had failed to save. And then, more recently, himself standing in the ritual chamber, watching Isolde approach, feeling the bitter certainty that this bond, like everything else, would crumble in his inadequate hands. Stop. The command came from somewhere outside the connection, cutting through the flow. Theron pulled back, breaking the kiss with visible effort. His hands remained on her face, his forehead pressed to hers as they both gasped for air. Enough, he rasped. Any more and we'll lose ourselves completely. Isolde's entire body trembled. She felt emptied out, scoured clean, and yet somehow fuller than she had ever been. The thread she had felt earlier, the one tied around her heart, was no longer pulling. It had settled, become part of her. And she knew without looking that the same thread connected her to Theron now. Blood and breath, woven together. That was... She couldn't find words. I know. His voice was rough, shaken. He drew back slowly, his hands falling away, and she immediately missed the contact. The old magic is... not gentle. Did it work? Yes. He looked down at the circle, where the symbols now pulsed with steady light. The first 2 bindings are complete, but the hardest part remains. Shadow. The confession of their darkest selves. Isolde's stomach nodded. After what they had just shared, the intimacy of that endless breath exchange, the glimpses into each other's souls, the idea of speaking her shame aloud felt almost unbearable. But Theron was already straightening, composing himself with visible effort. We should rest a moment, gather our strength. How long do we have? Until midnight. The shadow binding must be completed during the darkest hour. He glanced toward the chapel windows, where moonlight streamed pale and silver. Perhaps 2 hours. 2 hours to prepare for the worst part, to summon the courage to strip herself bare before this man who was no longer quite a stranger, but not quite anything else either. Tell me something, Isolde said suddenly. Something true. Not part of the ritual. Just something. Theron looked at her, surprised. What do you want to know? Your name. Your real name. She managed a shaky smile. Everyone calls you Lord Theron, but that's a title. What did your mother call you? Something softened in his expression, a crack in the ancient armor he wore. Ambrose. My given name was Ambrose Lucian Theron. He paused. No one has used it in over a century. Ambrose, she repeated softly, tasting the name. It suits you better than Lord. Does it? A hint of wry humor touched his mouth. I've worn the title so long I've almost forgotten there was a man beneath it. He's still there, Isolde said. I felt him. During the breath exchange, the boy who chased his brother through castle halls, the one who never wanted to be king. Ambrose, she found it easier to think of him that way now, closed his eyes briefly. You saw too much. You saw my memories too. Not enough to understand you. He opened his eyes again, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. You are more complicated than I expected, Isolde. More than the dutiful daughter you present to the world. Heat crept up her neck. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. He leaned forward slightly, and she found herself unable to look away. You pretend to be soft and yielding, but underneath you have a spine of steel. You pretend to accept your fate. But part of you has always resented it. Always wondered what your life might have been if you had been born to a different family, a different purpose. The words struck too close to truths she had never admitted, even to herself. It's not shameful, Ambrose interrupted gently. It's human, and it's part of what will make your shadow strong enough for the binding. He rose to his feet, offering her his hand. Come, we should walk. Clear our minds before midnight arrives. Isolde took his hand and let him pull her up. Her legs felt unsteady, her entire body thrumming with residual magic. They stepped out of the circle carefully. Breaking it now would undo everything they had accomplished, and moved toward the chapel doors. Outside, the night had deepened to full dark. Stars scattered across the sky like broken glass, and the forest below murmured with nocturnal life. Ambrose led her to a low stone wall at the cliff's edge, where they could sit and look out over the vast emptiness. Are you afraid? She asked. Of the shadow binding? Yes. No hesitation. I have spent centuries building walls around my darkest thoughts. The idea of tearing them down, of letting you see everything I've hidden. He exhaled slowly. It is more terrifying than facing the devourer itself. Isolde understood. She had her own walls, her own carefully maintained facades, and in less than 2 hours, she would have to demolish them all. What if I confess something that makes you hate me? She whispered. Ambrose turned to look at her, and the moonlight caught the planes of his face, making him seem simultaneously ageless and painfully young. Then I will accept it, he said simply, and weave it into the seal regardless. Because whatever darkness you carry, Isolde, it cannot be worse than the darkness we are trying to contain, and your courage in facing it will make the binding stronger. You can't know that. No, he agreed, but I have to believe it. Otherwise, this entire endeavor is madness, and we are fools for attempting it. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with anticipation. In the distance, a clock tower chimed. 11 bells. 1 hour remaining. Will you tell me first? Isolde asked quietly. Your confession? It might make it easier for me to know I'm not alone in this. Ambrose considered for a long moment. Then he nodded. Very well. When we return to the circle, I will speak my shadow first. His voice dropped. And you will witness it without judgment, as the ritual requires. Then you will do the same, and I will witness yours. And then? Then the magic will take our confessed darkness and bind it into the seal. And we will either succeed in containing the devourer. He looked out over the forest, toward the estate where something ancient stirred in its sleep. Or we will fail, and our souls will be consumed along with everything else. Not the most comforting thought, but Isolde found, strangely, that she was not as afraid as she had been. Perhaps the breath exchange had burned away some of her fear. Or perhaps she had simply accepted that this night would change her irrevocably, and there was a kind of peace in surrendering to the inevitable. "Tell me about Lady Celestine," she said instead. "The one buried beneath the altar. What was she like?" Ambrose's expression softened with memory. "I never knew her. She died long before I was born. But my brother used to tell me stories. Said she was fierce despite her devotion. That she once faced down an entire war party to protect mortal children sheltering in this chapel." He smiled faintly. "They say her blessing still protects this place. That no violence can occur within these walls without her spirit intervening. Do you believe that? I believe there are forces in this world we don't fully understand, and that love, true, sacrificial love, leaves marks that don't fade with time." He glanced at her. "Perhaps that's why this ritual requires such vulnerability, because the strongest magic comes from the strongest emotions, and there is nothing stronger than bearing witness to another's darkness and choosing to stand with them anyway." The clock tower chimed again. 11:30. "We should go back," Ambrose said quietly. "Prepare ourselves." They returned to the chapel in silence, the weight of what was coming pressing down on them both. The circle still glowed softly, waiting. Their tokens still sat on the small table, innocent and soon to be sacrificed. Isolde took her place on the cushion. Ambrose took his, and together, they waited for midnight to arrive. Chapter 8. The Confession of Shadows. Midnight came with the tolling of distant bells. The chapel air grew thick, heavy with expectation. The candles flickered though there was no wind, and the circle's symbols burned brighter, casting strange shadows that moved independent of their sources. Isolde felt the magic gathering, pressing against her skin like a physical weight. Across from her, Ambrose had gone very still. His eyes were closed, his hands rested on his knees in a posture of meditation or prayer. When he finally opened his eyes, they were darker than she had ever seen them, not with hunger, but with resignation. "The shadow binding requires complete honesty," he said, his voice formal once more. "I will speak my darkness. You will listen without judgment or interruption. When I finish, the magic will extract my confession and hold it visible between us, a manifestation of my shame." He paused. "It will not be pleasant to witness. But you must not look away. You must bear witness fully, or the binding will fail." Isolde nodded, her throat too tight for words. Ambrose drew a slow breath, then began. "I confess that I am a coward." His voice was steady, but something in it made Isolde's chest ache. "When my brother fell in battle 200 years ago, I did not grieve him as a brother should. I was relieved, because his death meant I would finally matter. I would finally be seen, not as the spare, but as the heir. The king." The air between them began to darken, wisps of shadow coalescing like smoke. "I confess that when I took the crown, I knew I was unworthy. I knew my bloodline magic was incomplete, that the bondmates who came after would pay the price for my inadequacy. But I took the throne anyway, because I was tired of being invisible, tired of being the second son, the contingency, the one only remembered when someone greater died." The shadows grew thicker, forming shapes, a crown made of thorns, a figure kneeling in defeat. "I confess that I have let women die rather than admit my weakness. 4 bondmates in 2 centuries, each one lasting shorter than the last as the seal degraded. I told myself their deaths were natural, that the bond had always been draining. But the truth is that my flawed bloodline accelerated their decline, and I did nothing to warn them. I needed the seal more than I needed their informed consent. Isolde's hands clenched in her lap. She wanted to speak, to protest, but the ritual forbade it. She could only listen, only witness. I confess that I am so desperately lonely that sometimes I envy mortals their short lives, because at least they die before everyone they love abandons them. At least they are not left standing in the ruins, century after century, watching new people arrive just long enough to see my failure before they too disappear into death or disgust. The shadows swirled faster now, taking on weight and substance. Faces of the bondmates who had died, their expressions accusing. A young boy standing beside an empty grave. A king alone on a vast throne. And I confess, his voice cracked. I confess that when I saw you tonight in the ritual chamber, young and whole and willing, my first thought was not gratitude, it was envy. Because you still have the luxury of hope, of believing your choices matter. And I have been doing this so long that I cannot remember what hope feels like anymore. The final words fell like stones into still water, and the shadows between them exploded into full manifestation. A writhing mass of dark smoke shot through with images of grief and guilt and bone-deep weariness. It was not a monster. It was something worse. The accumulated weight of 2 centuries of inadequacy, crystallized and made visible. Isolde stared at it, at the physical embodiment of Ambrose's shame, and felt tears streak down her face. Not from fear or disgust, but from the sheer magnitude of pain contained in that roiling darkness. No one should have to carry such weight alone. No one. Slowly, the shadow settled, no longer wild, but contained. Waiting. Your turn, Ambrose said hoarsely. Speak your darkness, Isolde. Let me witness you. Her throat closed. After seeing his confession, so raw, so vast, her own shame felt small and petty. What were her complaints compared to his centuries of suffering? What were her doubts compared to his bone-deep certainty of inadequacy? But the ritual did not care about comparisons. It required truth, however small or large. So she spoke. I confess that I have always been angry. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. Angry at my parents for raising me as nothing more than a sacrifice. Angry at my sister for being born second, for having the freedom I never had. Angry at the entire system that decided my worth before I could even speak. New shadows began to form, smaller than Ambrose's, but no less real. I confess that I have pretended to be dutiful, obedient, accepting, when inside I have dreamed of running away, of cutting my hair and stealing clothes and disappearing into a life where no one knew my name or my purpose. I have fantasized about it so many times I could draw you a map of the route I would take, name the villages where I would stop, describe the work I would do to survive. The shadows twisted into shapes. A girl running through darkness, a pair of scissors cutting through long hair, a map marked with impossible destinations. I confess that part of me hoped the bond would fail. Not consciously, I would never have sabotaged the ritual. But deep down, in a place I've never admitted to anyone, I wanted it to break. Because then, I would be free. Disgraced but free. No longer valuable enough to bargain with, no longer useful enough to sacrifice. More shadows joined the first, coalescing into a figure that looked like her but wasn't, a version of herself that had made different choices, lived a different life. And I confess that even now, even after everything you've shared with me, after seeing your loneliness and your burden, part of me still resents that I'm here. That I'm giving up my life to fix a problem I didn't create, to seal a darkness I never unleashed. Her voice broke. I don't want to die young. I don't want to be another name on the list of bondmates who sacrificed everything for a seal that will probably fail anyway. I want to live, Ambrose. I want to matter for something other than my blood." The shadows exploded outward, merging with his, her anger tangling with his loneliness, her resentment binding to his guilt. The two masses of darkness swirled together, forming something new, a helix of shadow that pulsed with combined pain and shame and desperate, aching humanity. And then, slowly, it began to condense. The magic took their confessed darkness, all of it, every word, every hidden thought, and compressed it down, down, down until it became something solid, something that glowed with a strange, cold light, a key. Isolde stared at it, suspended between them in the air. "What is that?" "Our shadows, bound together." Ambrose's voice was rough, exhausted. "The darkest parts of us, transformed into the final piece of the seal." He reached out slowly, and the key drifted toward his hand. "This is what will lock the devourer in place. Not blood alone, not breath alone. But this, the willingly offered brokenness of two souls who chose to stand together despite everything." He held the key up, and Isolde saw that it was not made of metal but of something else, crystallized shadow perhaps, or compressed darkness given form. It was beautiful in a terrible way. "One phase remains," Ambrose said quietly. "The covenant, the final binding that will seal everything we've done into the foundation of the prison. What does it require?" His eyes met hers across the space where their confessions had just burned. "Touch," he said simply. "Sustained, intentional touch while we speak the words of binding. The ritual texts are vague on the specifics, but the intent must be intimacy without reservation, trust without boundary." Heat flooded Isolde's face. "You mean, not consummation," Ambrose said quickly. "The ritual doesn't require that, but it does require closeness, vulnerability, the kind of contact that mortals reserve for those they love." He looked away. "I understand if you cannot. If what you've seen of my shadow has made the idea repellent." "It hasn't," Isolde interrupted, and she realized with surprise that it was true. If anything, seeing his darkness had made him more human to her, more real. The ancient, untouchable vampire king had been revealed as simply Ambrose, a man who had carried impossible weight for too long and was finally, desperately, asking for help. She rose from her cushion and moved around the small table. Ambrose watched her with something like wonder as she knelt before him, close enough to feel the coolness of his skin, close enough to see the silver flecks in his dark eyes. "Show me what to do," she said softly, and for the first time since she had met him, Ambrose smiled, small and sad and achingly grateful. "Thank you," he whispered. Then, gently, he reached for her. Chapter 9. The Covenant Sealed. His hands were careful, reverent even, as they settled on her shoulders. "The covenant requires sustained contact," Ambrose murmured. "Skin to skin, if you can bear it. The more surfaces touching, the stronger the binding." Isolde's heart thundered, but she nodded. She reached up and began unlacing the front of her simple dress, not to remove it entirely, but to expose her collarbone, the vulnerable hollow of her throat. Ambrose's eyes tracked the movement, and she saw his jaw tighten with effort. The hunger was there, always, but controlled. Leashed by will and the remnants of the magic they had already worked. She took his hands and placed them against her bare skin, one on her shoulder, one over her heart. His touch was cold, but not unpleasant, like marble warmed by distant sun. "And yours?" she said quietly. Ambrose hesitated, then shrugged out of his ceremonial robe, letting it pool around his waist. Beneath, his chest was pale and marked with old scars, evidence of battles fought and survived over centuries. Isolde raised her trembling hands and placed them against him, mirroring his position, over his heart, against his shoulder. The moment they completed the connection, the magic surged. It was different from the breath exchange, less violent, but deeper. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, slow and steady. Could feel the magic in his blood, ancient and strange. And she knew he could feel hers, quick and mortal and blazing with life. "Now we speak the binding," Ambrose said, his voice low. "Repeat after me." He began in that old language, the one that made the air hum, and Isolde echoed him, stumbling over unfamiliar sounds. But the magic didn't care about her pronunciation. It cared about intent, about the meaning beneath the words. "I bind my life to yours. I bind my shadow to the seal. I bind my choice to this moment, until the darkness sleeps, or I sleep eternal." The words settled into her bones, into her blood. She felt the thread that connected her to Ambrose pull taut. No longer just a connection, but a covenant. A promise written in the deepest parts of themselves. Ambrose continued, and she followed. "I offer what I am. I offer what I fear. I offer what I hope. That what we protect may live in light." The key, the crystallized shadow that hung in the air between them, began to glow. Brighter and brighter until Isolde had to squeeze her eyes shut against the intensity. She felt it sinking into her chest, into Ambrose's chest, becoming part of them both. And then she felt something else. A presence. Vast and terrible and far below them. The devourer, waking at the edges of its prison, drawn by the surge of magic. She felt its hunger, not for blood, but for fear, for despair, for all the darkness she and Ambrose had just offered up. It wanted in. "Hold on," Ambrose commanded, his hands tightening on her. "It will try to break through, to take what we're offering before the seal completes. Don't let go." Isolde pressed closer, her forehead coming to rest against his shoulder. She felt him wrap his arms around her fully, one hand cradling the back of her head. They were no longer kneeling formally. They were simply clinging to each other as the magic and the darkness warred around them. The chapel shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. The candles exploded into pillars of flame, and Isolde heard, or thought she heard, a scream rising from deep within the earth. A sound of rage and hunger and ancient, endless void. "Let us in," something whispered. "Let us feed. Let us finally rise." "No," Ambrose snarled against her hair. "You will sleep. You will remain sealed. We bind you with our darkness, with our blood, with everything we are." The magic detonated. Isolde felt it tear through her, not painfully, but completely. Every cell, every breath, every secret corner of her soul was scoured by the binding's completion. She felt herself fragmenting, pieces of her being carved away and woven into the seal. Felt Ambrose doing the same, giving of himself until there was almost nothing left. And then, suddenly, it was over. The light died. The shaking stopped. The presence beneath them screamed once more, then fell silent, pushed back down into its prison, locked away behind a seal now reinforced with their combined shadows. Isolde collapsed against Ambrose, gasping. He caught her, held her, his own breathing ragged despite his lack of need for air. They stayed that way for a long moment, tangled together in the center of the circle, surrounded by the smoking remains of candles and the fading glow of symbols. "Did it work?" Isolde finally whispered. "Yes." Ambrose's voice was hoarse. "I can feel it. The seal is strong again, stronger than it's been in a century." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes searching her face. "How do you feel?" Isolde took stock. Her body ached, but she was whole. She was breathing. She was different. She could feel it immediately, the way her senses had sharpened slightly, the way she could hear the forest outside with unnatural clarity, the way her awareness of Ambrose had become almost instinctual, as though part of her would always know where he was, what he felt. "Changed," she said finally. "I feel changed." "The bond does that." Ambrose's hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture almost tender. "You are mortal still, but touched by immortal magic now, connected to me and through me, to the seal. You will live longer than you would have otherwise, perhaps twice a mortal span, if we are fortunate. Twice a mortal span. 60 years, perhaps, instead of 30. More than Lady Alara had been granted, but still a fraction of Ambrose's eternity. And you?" she asked. "What did you lose?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "Warmth. I can feel it draining already, the last remnants of what made me human. The anger you saw in my shadow, the envy, the loneliness, those were tethers to my mortal past. Now they are part of the seal, and I am—" He trailed off, searching for words. "Colder, more distant. It is as the texts predicted." Isolde's throat ached. "I'm sorry. Don't be." His hand cupped her cheek. "It was a fair price, and I did not pay it alone." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Thank you, Isolde, for standing with me, for seeing my darkness and not turning away." "Thank you for the same," she whispered. They remained there in the ruins of the ritual circle as dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the chapel windows. The covenant was sealed, the devourer was bound, and two souls, one mortal, one immortal, were now tied together in a bond that would last until one or both of them finally, mercifully, found rest. Outside, the forest began to wake. Birds sang. Wind stirred the leaves. The world continued, unaware of how close it had come to darkness. And in the old chapel on the cliff, Ambrose and Isolde held each other and tried to remember who they had been before the binding transformed them into something new. Chapter 10. The morning after darkness, the walk back to the estate felt surreal. Isolde moved through the early morning mist with Ambrose silent beside her, their footsteps muffled by dew-soaked grass. Everything looked the same: the trees, the path, the distant outline of the castle. And yet, everything had changed. The world felt both sharper and more distant, as though she were seeing it through new eyes. Or perhaps through eyes that now carried the weight of what she and Ambrose had done. Her music box was gone. She had looked for it as they cleaned the ritual space, but the small table held only Ambrose's locket. Her grandmother's treasure had been consumed entirely, woven so completely into the seal that not even ash remained. She told herself it was worth it, that the lives saved justified the loss, but grief still sat heavy in her chest. "Your family will be waiting," Ambrose said quietly as the estate gates came into view. "Word must have reached them by now that you spent the night away from the main house." Isolde nodded. She had not thought about her family since the ritual began, had not allowed herself to think about the explanations that would be required, the questions she could not fully answer. "What should I tell them?" Ambrose was silent for a moment. "The truth? As much as you can. That we performed an alternative ritual. That the bond now holds, though differently than originally planned. That you are—" He hesitated. "Bound to me for the remainder of your life." The words should have felt like a prison sentence. Instead, they felt oddly like comfort. She was no longer alone in this strange new existence. Neither was he. "Will I need to stay here?" she asked. "At the estate?" "Not constantly. The bond does not require physical proximity." He glanced at her. "But you will need to return regularly, once a month perhaps, to reinforce the seal. And if the devourer stirs again, you will feel it. You will know. A lifetime of vigilance then, of waiting for darkness to test their binding. It was not the future she had imagined as a child, but perhaps it was the one she had been moving toward all along. They reached the main courtyard just as a carriage pulled up. Her family's carriage, Isolde realized with a jolt. Her mother emerged first, her face drawn with worry, and then her father, stern and controlled as always. And behind them, Clarissa, whose eyes went wide when she saw Isolde's disheveled state. "Isolde!" Her mother rushed forward, then stopped short when she registered Ambrose's presence. "My lord, we heard that you had called for our daughter again, that she did not return last night." The accusation hung unspoken in the air. "Lady Isolde was assisting me with a matter of great importance," Ambrose said, his voice taking on the formal authority Isolde had heard in the ritual chamber. "An alternative ritual has been performed. The bond now holds." Her father's expression sharpened. "What kind of alternative?" "The kind that required sacrifice from us both." Ambrose's gaze swept over them, cool and unyielding. "Your daughter has proven herself far braver than the circumstances demanded. She has earned my respect and my protection. She will want for nothing for the remainder of her life." It was a dismissal, polite but firm. Her family had no say in what had already been decided, but her mother persisted. "May we speak with her? Privately?" Ambrose glanced at Isolde, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, and he inclined his head. "Of course. I will await you inside, Lady Isolde." Then, with a slight bow to her parents, he strode toward the estate, leaving them alone. The moment he was out of earshot, her mother seized Isolde's hands. "What happened? You look different." "I am different." Isolde met her mother's eyes steadily. "The original bond failed, as you know, but there was another way. Older, more demanding. Lord Theron and I completed it last night. We are bound now, Mother. Not as husband and wife, but as guardians. As partners in a covenant that will hold for the rest of my life." Her father's expression darkened. "What does this covenant require of you?" "That I return here regularly to maintain the seal. That I remain tied to Lord Theron's purpose, protecting our lands from the darkness that sleeps beneath them." She pulled her hands free gently. "I know it's not the future you planned for me, but it is the one I have chosen." "Chosen?" Her mother's voice cracked. "You were manipulated." "No." Isolde's voice was firm. "I walked into that chapel of my own free will. I spoke the words of binding knowing the cost. And I would do it again, Mother, because the alternative was allowing something terrible to wake and destroy everything we hold dear." Clarissa stepped forward, her young face unusually solemn. "You saved us, didn't you? Whatever this darkness is, you and Lord Theron stopped it." Isolde looked at her sister, sweet, perceptive Clarissa, and managed a small smile. "Yes, we did." Her father was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then, slowly, he nodded. "If this is truly your choice, Isolde, then we will honor it. But know that your home remains open to you. Always." The words, grudging though they were, still made Isolde's eyes sting. "Thank you." They spoke for a while longer. Arrangements, practicalities, the story they would tell the mortal courts about the bond's success. Her mother wept quietly. Her father maintained his stern facade, and Clarissa hugged Isolde tightly, whispering, "You're the bravest person I know." When they finally departed, Isolde stood in the courtyard and watched their carriage disappear down the winding road. She felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. "That was harder than the ritual," a voice said behind her. She turned to find Ambrose standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the morning light. "Yes," she agreed, "in some ways." He approached slowly, stopping a few paces away. "I have prepared rooms for you in the East Wing. You may come and go as you please, but you should rest." The binding will continue to settle for several days, and you will need your strength." Isolde nodded, but made no move toward the estate. Instead, she looked up at Ambrose, this strange, lonely man who had become her partner in an impossible task, and asked the question that had been building since the ritual ended. "What happens now? Between us?" Ambrose's expression flickered with something too complex to name. "I don't know," he admitted. "The bond ties us together, but it does not dictate how we must interact. We can be allies, companions, or simply two people bound by necessity but otherwise separate. Which would you prefer?" He looked away, toward the forest that stretched endlessly beyond the estate. "I have been alone for so long that I am not certain I remember how to be otherwise. But—" He paused, and when he continued, his voice was softer. "I think I would like to try, if you are willing." Isolde felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The beginning of something that might, given time and patience, become more than just a covenant sealed in darkness. "I'm willing," she said quietly. Ambrose's eyes returned to hers, and for the first time since they met, she saw him truly smile, small and tentative and achingly human. "Then perhaps," he said, "we will find that we saved more than just the world last night." And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the last remnants of mist, Isolde thought that perhaps, just perhaps, he might be right. Chapter 11. Eternal in the Quiet Spaces. 3 months passed in strange, gentle rhythm. Isolde divided her time between the estate and her family's home, though she found herself drawn more and more to the former. There was a peace in the old stone halls, in the library where Ambrose spent his evenings, in the gardens that bloomed even in the onset of autumn. The bond had settled into a constant, quiet presence, a thread connecting her to Ambrose that she could feel regardless of distance. When he was troubled, she knew. When she was restless, he sensed it. They did not speak of it often, this strange intimacy, but it colored everything between them. They were careful with each other in those early months, polite, respectful. Two people learning to orbit the same space after lifetimes of solitude. But slowly, carefully, something shifted. It began with small things. Ambrose leaving books he thought she would enjoy on the table in her room. Isolde bringing him tea, though he could not drink it, simply to sit in companionable silence while he worked. Conversations that stretched late into the night, covering everything from philosophy to the mundane details of managing an estate. And then, one evening, Isolde found him in the old chapel. She had returned for the monthly reinforcement ritual, but when she arrived at the estate, a servant informed her that Lord Theron had gone ahead to prepare the space. So she walked the familiar path through the forest, her cloak drawn against the autumn chill. She found him kneeling before the altar, his head bowed, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. He looked smaller, somehow. Less like the ancient vampire king, and more like the boy she had glimpsed in his memories, the second son, praying for guidance he would never receive. "Ambrose," she said softly. He turned, surprise flickering across his features. "You're early." "I wanted to see you." The admission came easier now than it would have 3 months ago. She approached slowly, settling onto the cold stone beside him. "What are you doing?" "Thinking." He looked back at the altar, at the inscription marking Lady Celestine's resting place. About how many people have knelt here over the centuries, how many have bargained with fate, with magic, with powers beyond their understanding. His voice was quiet. How many of them found what they were seeking? Isolde studied his profile, the sharp lines softened by candlelight, the eyes that still carried centuries of weariness but no longer seemed quite so alone. "Have you found what you were seeking?" she asked. Ambrose was silent for a long moment. Then, I did not know what I was seeking until I found it. He turned to her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. I thought I needed another bondmate, another tool to maintain the seal, but what I needed was something else entirely. What? A reminder that I am not merely a function, not merely a keeper of darkness. He reached out slowly, his hand settling over hers on the cold stone. You have given me that, Isolde. In 3 months, you have reminded me of what it means to be something other than a guardian, to be a person. Her throat tightened. You've done the same for me, shown me that my value is not merely in my bloodline or my sacrifice, but in the choices I make. They sat like that for a while, hands touching, surrounded by the weight of the chapel's history. The ritual could wait. This moment, fragile and honest, felt more important. I have something for you, Ambrose said finally. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. I meant to give it to you when you arrived, but perhaps this is better timing. Isolde took it carefully, unwrapping the cloth to reveal her music box. Not the original, she realized immediately. The wood was new, the mother-of-pearl inlay slightly different in pattern, but the shape was identical. And when she opened it, the same lullaby played, her grandmother's lullaby, preserved and restored. How? She whispered. I commissioned it from a craftsman in the mortal city, described the original in detail and hummed the melody until he could replicate it. Ambrose looked almost embarrassed. I know it is not the same, that the one you sacrificed carried your history in a way this never can, but I thought, perhaps you would like to have the music back, at least. Isolde stared at the box, at the care that had gone into its recreation, at the thoughtfulness of this ancient, supposedly cold creature who had noticed her grief and tried to ease it. Thank you, she managed past the lump in her throat. Ambrose, this is... Thank you. He smiled, that small, tentative expression that appeared more frequently now. You are welcome. She closed the music box carefully and set it aside. Then, before she could lose her nerve, she leaned forward and kissed him. Not as part of a ritual, not as an exchange of breath or magic, simply as a woman kissing a man she had come to care for deeply. Ambrose went very still, his surprise evident, but after a moment his hand came up to cup her cheek, and he kissed her back, gently, carefully, as though she were something precious he feared breaking. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. I did not expect... He trailed off. Neither did I, Isolde admitted, but here we are. Here we are, he echoed. A pause. I am not easy to love, Isolde. I am cold and distant and carry more ghosts than any one person should. If you choose this, choose me beyond the bond, it will not be simple. Nothing worth having ever is. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. And I am not afraid of ghosts, Ambrose. Not after everything we've faced together. He studied her for a long moment, as though searching for doubt. Finding none, something in his expression softened, cracked open, revealing the vulnerability he usually kept so carefully hidden. Then perhaps, he said quietly, we might build something here, in the quiet spaces between darkness and duty, something that is ours alone. I would like that, Isolde said. And so they did. In the years that followed, they became more than guardian and bondmate, more than partners in a covenant sealed by shadow and blood. They became companions in the truest sense, two people who had walked into darkness together and emerged changed but not broken. Isolde lived twice a mortal span as Ambrose had predicted. She watched her sister marry and have children of her own, watched her parents grow old and pass peacefully into rest, and through it all, Ambrose stood beside her, constant, steady, a presence that became as necessary as breathing. The seal held. The devourer slept. And in the old chapel where they had bound their souls together, flowers bloomed year-round without explanation. Lady Celestine's blessing, perhaps, on two people who had proven that even the darkest magic could be tempered by willing sacrifice and quiet, growing love. When Isolde's final years approached, Ambrose did not rage against mortality or try to find ways to extend her life beyond what the bond allowed. Instead, he simply stayed close, holding her hand through the slow dimming, sharing stories of the long life they had built together. "Do you regret it?" he asked one evening as they sat in the library, firelight casting gentle shadows across her aged face. "Walking into that chapel with me?" Isolde, her hair now silver, her hands marked by time, smiled. "Never. Not for a single moment. Even knowing how it would end? Especially knowing." She squeezed his hand, still strong despite the years, still cool despite the warmth she had brought to his existence. "Because I got to spend my life mattering, Ambrose, not as a sacrifice or a tool, but as a person, as your companion, your equal." Her smile widened. "Your love. Always," he whispered. "For as long as I exist, I will carry you with me." And when she finally slipped away, peacefully, in the same chair where they had spent countless evenings reading together, Ambrose did not break. He grieved deeply and honestly, in a way he had not allowed himself to grieve in centuries. But he did not despair. Because Isolde had taught him something crucial in their years together, that loneliness was not inevitable, that even immortals could find connection, meaning, purpose beyond mere survival. He buried her beside Lady Celestine in the chapel, beneath a marker that read simply, "Isolde, who walked into darkness and made it beautiful." And in the centuries that followed, when new threats arose and new bondmates were required, Ambrose approached them differently, with honesty, with respect. With the understanding that they were not tools, but people deserving of choice and agency. He never forgot the woman who had chosen to stay when she could have walked away, who had seen his darkness and stood with him anyway, who had taught him that even a covenant sealed in shadow could become something luminous. And in the quiet spaces between darkness and duty, he carried her memory like a candle, small, steady, and eternal.